Imagine waking up in the middle of the night with an overwhelming need to talk to someone you can't reach anymore. The kind of someone who used to be your only real connection in life. Now, they're gone and you're left with nothing but memories. What if in your grief you find yourself facing something far more terrifying than a lost loved one? This chilling Reddit post is about just that. Death, loss, and an encounter with something that defies explanation. This story will take you to a place where the lines between life and death blur, where strange discoveries at an abandoned site lead to a man's chilling confession and the unsettling truth of his abilities. On November 20, 2018, Clark County Fire Department personnel responded to a blaze at a remote location in the Mojave Desert. Upon arrival, they noted that the burning building was an abandoned train depot. Once the fire was contained, they noted several irregularities in the ashes. Although the fire had destroyed the building far beyond any hope of repair, hundreds of personal items scattered across the floor were undamaged. These items included purses, glasses, personal identification cards, dog collars, laptop cell phones, coats, jackets, pagers, backpacks, hygiene supply hats, tools, and much more. The items spanned multiple decades in terms of manufacturing date. Some of the items were tools and implements dating back centuries. No items could be linked to the others. Approximately 350 human bones were discovered under the floor, arranged in what law enforcement later described as a ritualistic array. A chief among these irregularities was a large skeleton that exhibited what the coroner described as unnatural proportions. One redacted report suggests that the skeleton possessed structures similar to wings. The most surprising discovery, however, was a middle-aged man weeping among the ruins. He introduced himself as David and apologized for burning the depot down. It didn't have to be done, he allegedly stated, but I still had to do it. He was detained and arrested for suspicion of arson and homicide. The homicide charges were later dropped when testing indicated that the human bones were a minimum of 300 years old. The arson charges were successful, based on the details of his testimony and his clearly unstable mental state. However, the suspect was sentenced to a secure mental health facility where he spent 4 years before undercover personnel discovered him, at which point he was transferred to NASCU. Shortly after incarceration, the inmate submitted to various assessments and field tests. The findings were unusual, even by agency standards. In simplest terms, David seemingly possesses the ability to locate the souls of deceased individuals, at which point he is compelled to hear their final statements, which David understandably refers to as confessions, while escorting them to what he calls the other side. These duties were and remain psychologically distressing. Immediately prior to burning the depot down, David states that he failed to transport a passenger. The details of this failure remain unknown. David did not discuss them at any point during the interview recorded below. At this time, the agency plans to implement ongoing treatment with the goal of identifying and hopefully rectifying the details of this failure. Administration hopes to evaluate and, if appropriate, commission David as a T-class agent upon completion of his treatment. Prior to his arrest, David's mode of conveyance for these trips was his truck. David presents as a Caucasian male between the ages of 60 to 65. He's approximately 5'8", tall, with dark hair and brown eyes. David's diagnoses include depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and severe insomnia. It should be noted the site of David's depot bore signs of ritualistic use dating back approximately 500 years. The site is currently under quarantine. It should also be noted that inmate 17 has expressed repeated interest in David. Finally, the interviewers would like to note that David has expressed a desire to change his title to something less ominous, such as the ferryman. Interview subject: the Pale Horseman classification string non-cooperative thiv destructible C constant low ASI fellows interviewers and Critchell B. Interview date that 109th of 2024 one night. I woke up and really needed to talk to my dad. Of course I couldn't because he died about a month before. I paid for the funeral. It was so small and so cheap it was basically an insult to his memory, and it still ate most of my savings. I didn't regret it. I was just ashamed I couldn't afford to give him something better. Still am. Arranging the burial kept my mind busy. When you're busy enough, nothing really has the opportunity to sink in. But the night I woke up needing to talk to my dad was when it sank in that he was really gone. I got out of bed and went for a drive. Drives were something my dad and I used to do. Probably the only actual bonding time we ever had. It was hard for us to talk to each other, or to anyone really. We were both human dams. But something about those drives broke the dams broke down. We had to actually be driving, though. For some reason we said a word till after the wheels were moving. Night drives were the best, somehow. We never even looked at each other, but talked all the way to the other end of the highway and back. He'd always play music from when he was a kid. Sometimes he'd stop at the gas station for sodas and candy. Once in a while, he'd pull into the all-night diner and buy me breakfast for late dinner. Mostly we didn't stop at all. We just drove. But it didn't matter where we did or didn't stop. All that mattered was I got to go for a drive with my dad. The night I needed to talk to him but couldn't, I went for a drive. Partly because I missed him, partly because I wanted to be able to cry privately. Me crying always freaked both Amber and Devin out. And she didn't need any extra stress. But mostly because when it comes right down to it, solo driving is the most soothing thing I've ever done. Night driving particularly. Night driving in the desert especially. The moon's silvered landscape is this patchwork of contrasts. All shadow and silver, dim light and dark so deep it makes that dimness look bright. There's an inhuman, almost primal peace I find when I'm out there. It's liberating and eerie and beautiful all at once to be alone on the road at night. An exercise in isolation. Isolation can be hard, but it's the only time I feel comfortable being myself. So the isolation has always been a draw. So is the desolation. The desolation of the desert is impersonal and gentle. Sometimes that's exactly what you need, a reminder that you're less than the blink of an eye, that everything you feel and everything you've done won't even be remembered. That sounds bitter, but it's not. At least not to me. In fact, that's the only time I get safe enough to actually feel the things that make me hurt. On that night and on that drive, I was remembering the night before my dad went to the hospital for the last time. He was still himself, but his mind was not exactly slipping but traveling. Flitting back and forth between childhood and adulthood, and staying back more often than not. That night especially, it was kind of like he was a little boy again. He was scared of the dark and started crying, so I got in bed with him the way I used to when my kid had nightmares. He snuggled in just like Devin used to and started talking about his life. Things I never knew. Things I never even thought to ask. God, that was hard. Knowing there was so much he never told me. So much I'll never know. He got to talking about his mom. I asked him a question. I don't even remember what, and he sat up hopefully, asking if his mama was there. "No, Dad," I said gently. "Is she coming?" The hope in his voice broke me. Remembering his as I drove along the road that night broke me all over again. The desert glided past as I cried, shadows and darkness all covered in a thin film of silver moon. That landscape reminded me of my heart, a bottomless dark pit filmed over with whatever light I could muster for my family's sake. At some point, I noticed the road was different. I know that road. I know every bump and shimmy. You know how desert highways can be. Rippled, warped, cracked. I knew the stretch of road I was on was so broken up it sometimes felt like a monster was reaching up from under the asphalt and jerking your wheels around for the fun of it. It had always been that way. I figured it would always be that way. But that night, that stretch of road was so smooth it felt like my wheels weren't even touching the ground. Like my truck was gliding on air. That's when I saw the hitchhiker. I don't pick up hitchhikers. Not because I expect anything bad to happen. I really don't. I found that it's easier to trust everyone until they give me a reason not to, and hitchhikers are no exception. The only reason I didn't pick them up is because I had a family and they needed me. I couldn't take the risk, even a small one, for their sakes. But this guy, I had to pick him up because in silhouette at least, he reminded me of my dad. I'm not big on fate or mysticism, not at all. But I do believe in human connection. I think everything on Earth is more deeply connected than any of us know or even want to acknowledge, and denying that connection is the root of a lot of problems. I guess that actually sounds pretty mystical. But why was I even on the road? Right? Woke up missing my dad and went for a drive specifically to cry for him where no one would have to see. On this drive, I just happened to see a guy in need who looks like my dad asking for help. What are the chances? 0. Those chances are 0. It felt like one of those connections, so I pulled over. The hitchhiker climbed in as coyotes howled nearby, pleasantly eerie. The desert outside looked darker and brighter than ever. Up close, the guy looked so much like my dad that it made me choke up. I managed to ask, "Where you headed?" "We'll know when we see it." It was my dad's voice. Chills exploded. For a second, I thought I was going to scream. Instead, I flicked on the cab light, but the hitchhiker flicked it right back off. "David," he said, "I need you to hear everything I never told you." "Dad." I remembered the way he'd said mama on his last night at home. That's what my voice reminded me of. "Where's my mama? Is she here? Moma, are you here? Dad, are you here?" He didn't answer. But of course he didn't. He couldn't, because the wheels weren't moving yet. I put the truck in gear and started driving on that road so smooth it felt like my wheels were touching nothing but air. Once we were at speed, my dad started talking. "I loved my mom," he said. "She did so much for me, more than I could ever do for her. I did everything I could. I went hunting out in the hills for food, set traps and checked them every day with my old hound dog. I miss him." He wiped his eyes. "But my mama, I helped her clean and make dinner. Tried to do all my chores without being asked. She was the best, David. Just the best. I'd give so much for you to know her. She'd have loved you. I think she would have showed me how to love you better than I did. Reminded me that it's not weak to love well. That not loving well is the weakness. I adored her, David. I wanted to grow up be like her," he sighed. "Instead, I grew up to be like my dad. That's not bad. He wasn't a bad man. He just was how he was. Just like me. You'll know how he was because you know how I was. Always telling you how you did this or that or said that wrong. I did that because I's what he did to me. And you know, it taught me to apply myself. Taught me to learn fast, to do everything on my own, to hold everything together even when I didn't know how to hold myself together. I saw what that did to him. I recognized that it did the same to me, and I know it's the same for you. I'm sorry." He wiped his eyes again. "He wasn't sure I wanted children, but back then you didn't really get a say. It was just what you did, so I did it. But I was worried, David. I was scared. But I couldn't admit that. My dad taught me not to get scared. But even though I couldn't admit it, I was scared right up till the second you were born. And when I saw you, the most beautiful baby boy that ever was, I was still scared, but I was so happy. When I held you, the world got brighter than bright. I promised you, and myself, that I'd give you the whole bright world, that I'd be as good a dad to you as my mama was to me. I wanted to. David, I wanted to more than I ever wanted anything. But I couldn't figure out how. I wanted to speak so badly. I felt my dam coming down. But it was still holding, and my dad's was broken in a way nothing had ever been broken. So I kept my mouth shut. I couldn't even say I love you when you started getting bigger, not because I didn't. I did, I do. More than I ever showed and more than you'll ever know. I was just so afraid I'd say it wrong. I was afraid I was doing everything wrong. I started believing I was doing everything wrong. I started feeling you'd be better off if I wasn't too involved. The way I'd have probably been better off if my own dad hadn't been too involved. I didn't think it. Not like that. I just felt it. To be as good a dad as my mom was a mom took something I didn't have. Something I didn't know how to get. You know how I was, David. You know, if I couldn't figure out how to do something in 2 minutes flat, then I just didn't learn. That's the worst thing I ever did. I wanted to tell you, I wanted to be that for you. I never was, and now I never will be. But I love you, and I wish I'd known how to make every minute of every day be as good as our night drives. Here's my stop. Getting out here. He pointed to this little train depot just off the highway. It was tiny. Light spilled from the windows, so bright the building looked like it was suspended in a tiny sun. I pulled over. He patted my shoulder and said, "Thank you for hearing." Then he got out and walked across the sand to the depot. When the door swung shut behind him, the lights went out. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel for dear life while I sobbed. Then I headed home. About 10 minutes into the drive, my wheels start grinding on the asphalt again. When I got home, Amber was awake and she was a wreck. She wasn't doing well. She never really had, but it got really bad after her sister passed and never got better. It took me hours to calm her down. She kept repeating, "I thought you left me." I told her what I always did. "I'll never leave you." Our son, Devin, was waiting in the kitchen after she finally fell asleep. "I hate her," he said, "or at least what she's become. And you're not any better. You never were." He took off before I could say a word. I didn't try to stop him. Not because I didn't want to. Just because I didn't know how. I didn't really get the chance to process what happened that night. But I don't think it would have made a difference. Definitely wouldn't have changed the fact that I didn't know what I thought about it. In the end, I wrote it off as a trick of grief. You know, near-death experiences supposedly only manifest to ease the distress of passing. I figured my experience with my dad manifested to soothe the distress of grief. Until a couple weeks later, when I woke up in the middle of the night needing to talk to Dad again. I can't describe the excitement or the hope. Hope that everything I ever believed about connection and interconnectedness was real. That my dad and I finally had the connection we always wanted but couldn't forge. A connection strong enough to bypass or even wormhole through death itself. I got in my truck and went for a drive. About halfway down that buckled, broken highway, the asphalt smoothed out, and it felt like my wheels weren't touching the ground. And a couple minutes later, I saw a hitchhiker. My heart kind of swelled, and I felt this big smile spread over my face as I imagined another night drive with my dad. But this hitchhiker wasn't my dad. It was a woman. I thought about my grandma. I even thought about Amber's sister. I pulled over. She got inside. I didn't know her, but she seemed to know me. "Mum," she said, "I need you to hear everything I never told you." I frowned, but started to drive. I took care of Roxy just like you told me to. I really did. But I also really didn't do it right. I felt a sick swoop in my stomach, but didn't say anything. That's one of the rules of night driving, you don't interrupt. I wasn't cruel to her, wasn't mean, didn't neglect her. I would never, not ever. I took care of her. But didn't love her. I didn't love her because I was jealous of her. How fucking ridiculous is that? Jealous of a goddamn dog. She sniffed and wiped her eyes. I was jealous because of how much you loved her. And Mom, I get it. Dogs had Roxy, and Roxy was really great even for a dog. But she was still just a dog, and you bought her more clothes than you ever bought me. You put more effort into her treats and prescription food than you ever did for me. You used to feed me stuff that made me sick. I know it was because you couldn't afford anything else. But you still spent more on her. You took her to the vet more than you ever took me to the doctor. And it's not like you knew, but not going to the doctor is how I ended up here at 44 years old. But none of that even matters. What matters is you gave the dog all the love you didn't want to give me. And I get why. I do. Roxy is Roxy, and I'm welcome me. Her face crumpled and she wiped her eyes again. I tried to overcome those feelings because they were so ugly and so stupid. Who gets jealous of a goddamn dog, especially such a good one? People like me, I guess. I tried to overcome it. I tried to kill the jealousy. But I couldn't. And you know what? That dog loved me anyway. As much as she loved you. As much as I loved you. Hell, sometimes I think she loved me more. Why do children and dogs have to love as deeply as they do? I always wondered that. It's not fair, it's not fucking fair. She released a shaky breath. You know, Roxy wasn't allowed to sleep on my bed. That was a big no-no, and she knew it. But sometimes I'd wake up crying or I'd have a panic attack, and she'd jump up and nuzzle me until I calmed down. Then I'd put her back on the floor. She uttered a sob. What did I do that? Why? All she wanted was for me to love her back, and she was so easy to love too. I still couldn't do it. She died on a Tuesday morning before work. It was winter. She didn't want to get up. I thought she just didn't want to go outside because of the snow, so I forced her. But she wasn't being a brat. She was in heart failure, and the stress of walking in the snow, oh my God, Mom. She crawled into my lap and died there. If I hadn't made her go outside, she wouldn't have died like that. Not in the lap of someone who never let her on the bed unless they got something out of it. And she laughed, then sobbed again. If someone gave me the choice, I would burn in hell for an eternity of eternities, if it meant I could go back to give her the life she deserved from me. Sometimes I wonder if you ever felt the same way about me, Mom. I don't know what would be worse if you didn't, or if you did. Here's my stop. Let me out here. Thank you for hearing. Just off the highway, the train depot shimmered into bright, blinding being. The lady got out and trudged across the sand. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but when the door swung open, I saw the silhouette of a little dog in the doorway, tail wagging 1,000,000 miles a minute. When I got home, it was almost dawn and Divin was having a breakdown in the front yard. Amber was trying to calm him down. When I pulled up, she ran over and started raging at me about everything and nothing. I sent her inside to rest and took over. Divin was coming down off something, and I could tell it was a rough landing. It happened a lot. Every couple months at least. It used to make me angry, but I didn't have it in me to be angry anymore. Even if that wasn't strictly true. My anger only ever made things worse. Both Devin and Amber had plenty to be angry about without me adding to it. So I shut the anger down and sat on the grass with him. Devin started talking. I tried to listen, but it was hard. My mind was going as fast as that little dog's tail. 1,000,000 miles an hour, only these weren't happy miles. All I could think is how pointless it all was. How this life was all I had and all my kid would ever have if he was lucky. Not for the first time I felt like I'd cursed my kid. In a good month, I could afford to give him half of what he needed and none of what he deserved. What kind of life is that? How shitty is it? To love someone so much that you'd kill or die to make them happy, but to never have the chance to do either. This is all he gets, I thought. This is all any of us get. What's the point? A few nights later, I again woke up needing to talk to my dad. I got in the truck and drove along that rutted, broken highway until it turned so smooth it felt like my wheels were running along the air. A few minutes later, I saw an impossibly small hitchhiker waiting on the side of the road. I pulled over. This tiny little boy climbed in. He looked so sick, and he was so small I had to help him. "Daddy," he said, "I need you to hear everything I never told you." I started driving. I wanted to meet my baby sister. I tried to hold on to see her, just like you asked. I tried to be strong, but I wasn't. I'm sorry I couldn't hold it anymore. I was too tired, Daddy. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I kept making you and Mommy cry. His lip trembled. He looked out the window at the wide, pale moon and the silver dark desert. Are you going to forget me, since you have a new baby now? I started crying too. Please don't forget me. I won't ever forget you. I won't forget Mommy singing to me and holding my hands when I was in the hospital. I won't forget when you were crying in the garage. I was scared because you never cry, but then you hugged me and said I was brave, and you were only crying because you were happy I was so brave. I won't forget that, Daddy. I'm sorry I made you cry all the time. I'm glad you'll have a new baby to make you smile. Just don't forget me when you smile. And please don't cry when you remember me. Please just smile. I think I need to get out here. Thank you for hearing. The depot shimmered just off the highway, brighter and soft. Can you walk with me, Daddy? I know you can't go in, but I'm scared of the dark. I got out first, then helped him down onto the ground. He squeezed my hand as we walked across the sand. Is it going to hurt? No, I said. I promise. When we reached the door, he looked up at me, beaming. He didn't look sick anymore. Thank you. I won't forget you. Don't forget me. The door swung shut behind him, and the lights went out. There was such pressure in my chest, heavy and painful, expanding at the speed of light. It felt like it was going to crush me and make me explode at the same time. I opened the depot door. It was dark inside, and empty except for spiders. I went back to my truck and drove home. The road stayed smooth for hours. For so long I started getting scared. My wheels didn't touch asphalt again until dawn. It felt like a warning. So I decided, no matter what, that I would never touch the depot door again. This arrangement, if that's what you want to call it, continued for a while. Maybe once a week I'd wake up needing to talk to my dad. I'd get up and go for my night drive in the desert, trundling down the jagged highway that was so broken it felt like a monster was reaching mess with to my axles right up to the second the road turned smoother than air. A couple minutes later, I always found a hitchhiker. They were all sad, even the happy ones. That was hard. Being whoever they needed to talk to was harder. None of those people ever knew they were talking to an old, fat truck driver named David. They thought they were talking to their dads or moms or grandparents or spouses or lovers or friends or siblings or enemies or kids. Most of them were relieved to see the depot come shimmering into view. A few were anxious. One was terrified. He was disgusting. From the second I saw his silhouette on the side of the highway, everything in me started screaming. For the first time, I thought about driving on past and leaving him in the dust. I almost did, but then I remembered that morning where my wheels just wouldn't touch the ground again. So I stopped, and he climbed in. He was too human and too inhuman at the same time, and what he told me I've never even imagined someone could think those things, let alone say them, let alone do them. But he had, and he wasn't sorry. He was gleeful. When he saw my disgust, he laughed. "What did I tell you, Kate? I'm more than human and I'm less. This is my stop. Thank you for hearing." The depot was there, but the windows dark. When we pulled up, his eyes went dark too. He looked at me. Instead of glee, I saw terror. "I can't go in there," he said. "I won't," before I could stop him. Not that I had any idea how I would. He jumped out and bolted out across the desert. The full moon cast a wild, awful shadow behind him. As I pulled away, I saw the depot door opening. Something slithered out, something huge and just as awful as him, and took off into the desert, chasing him in his hideous shadow. When I got home, there was an ambulance in my driveway. Paramedics were wheeling Devon out on a stretcher. Amber was sobbing. Before I even got out of the car, I was sobbing too. I tried to hug her, but she threw me off. Devon died that night. I didn't sleep for weeks. There was no one I felt like I needed to talk to for weeks. I'm not sure I felt anything. I think I just wanted to die. The first dead, dreamless sleep I'd happened 5 weeks after he died. It lasted 2 hours. Then I woke up needing to talk to him. I was already crying by the time I reached my truck. I drove out onto the highway under the moon, through the silvered darkness and the howling coyotes. Their song sounded like what was inside my heart. The broken road knitted itself, turning so smooth it felt like there was no road at all, only air. And then there he was, my boy, standing on the side of the road, waiting for me. I pulled over. Rage, grief, and joy rushed through me, none stronger than the other. Devon got into the truck, scared and wide-eyed. I put the truck in gear and we started driving. "I need you to hear everything I never told you," he said. And something inside me broke. A dam, but the wrong dam. Before my son could open his mouth again, I broke apart and started raging at him. Years and years of things that had built up behind the dam. Years and years of things I never told him. But not all of the things I never told him. Only part of them. And only the bad part. He didn't say a word. I raged until we reached a depot all blazing bright and gold. He opened the door before I even pulled over. Too late. I realized what I'd done. I reached for him, but he shoved me away and ran. I got out and chased after him, but I was slow and he was fast, and before I made it halfway, he vanished inside the depot, and the lights went out. I stood outside, shrieking and begging him to come back out. He didn't. After a long, long time, I went back to my truck. I was scared I'd never find my way back home after that, but my wheels touched the road almost immediately. When I got home, Amber was gone. I didn't get a passenger for months. I barely slept, and woke up 10 times a night when I did. But I never woke up needing to talk to anybody. I never felt any connection. I never felt any hope. It started again about a year later, and went along a regular clip right up until I fucked up. Just like I fucked up everything else. But until then, it was good. I did what I was supposed to. I picked them up. They told me the things they never told anyone else. I listened and delivered them to their destination. ferried them to the last stop before their final destination. The depot was almost always bright. I'm not sure why I care anymore, but I'm glad it was bright. I'm so glad that for most of us, the end is soft and golden light.